Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Daylight Savings Time. Spring has come to us. As it was, see a lot of you here without your dogs, so probably I know your dog's name, but I probably don't know yours. If I could remind you, please, to turn your phones off or put it on the vibrate, and Julie will hopefully remind one of us to tell you to put it on again, but it's something. We have an email sign-up sheet in the back if you would like to receive an announcement from us about our speakers coming in. Yeah, they never joke, we're kind of sell it and nobody would give us $1. Not 1 cent, you guys, you know anymore. Okay, yeah, two things here. Matt's early. Matt, where are you? Matt's sitting in the back there. See Matt? Matt has asked me to talk to you about the Aging in Place group is hosting a forum on the topic of social isolation in the Burger Center on April 5th, 2025 from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Following short presentation, the format will be centered around facilitated small table conversations with ample opportunity for sharing. Look for the articles in the Oklahoma News for more details. Also in the back, there are some flyers there for that and for pre-registration. And again, that's for Aging in Place here in Oklahoma. Kathy Byrne, where are you, Kathy? She's somewhere here. Oh, she's over there. There you are. So over there, over on the side. Kathy is with the Oklahoma Art Association, and they're having their 51st annual show in Art Fair, March 21st and 22nd, right here at Burger. Friday 10 a.m. to 4, Saturday 10 a.m. to 5, and guess what? It's free. Free admission, okay? And 50 plus art exhibitors will be showing. They do have a wonderful raffle. I know because Kathy, I won it once because I took the whole $20 and put it into one thing and won it. It's a great book too. Okay, Evelyn. Evelyn's here also. Evelyn, what's the preview for Lifelong Learning? March 19th is the preview. What classes did you say? I could glad to tell you what classes. Baseball yesterday and today with Nick Chandler. Yay! David Bowie, Glam Rock Starman. That's with Richie Underberger. Santa Rosa's Remarkable History, Bill Montgomery with a special guest. I don't know this one. And Tombstone, Arizona, that's a quick one. That's May 12th and 19th. And that's Dennis Cornell will be doing those classes. And there are more of these little flyers for that if you so desire to pick them up. How many people are into birds, birding, spotting birds, etc.? Do you know what's happening this time next week? Yes, Carolyn Green will be speaking on Do You Bird? The Amazing Birds of Oakmont and Beyond. And you may think you have no interest in birds, but warning, expose yourself to a little bit of birding, and even you can become addicted in a positive and fun way. Carolyn, with her experience as a field biologist with the National Park Service and other organizations, knows her stuff, and she will be sharing her stories here about the birds in Oakmont and beyond. Jeff, where are you, Jeff? PSA.
Public Safety Announcement. Service announcement. I'm Jeff, and I run the AV for these meetings, and this is a semi-prank. Groups are in here Friday night and Saturday night making changes on the rack. As a result, I have no cameras, I have no audio coming out of the room speakers, and so what you're hearing and what you're seeing right now is the result of about an hour and a half of mad scrambling. Lots of conversations with maintenance. So this is just my plea that if other groups are in here using the system, you absolutely have to make sure it's left the way you found it. This was all working during lifelong learning last Wednesday or Thursday. That was the last time I was in here. I'm in here a lot. I'm one of probably 3 people, Jane Georgie, myself, maybe just a couple other people who really know how to use the rack system back there. But there's a lot of noise in Oakmont that says we need to replace all the AV equipment because it's never working. It's never working because of active fingers. So let's try and be good about that. Thank you. The big result of this, I have no way to show a movie this afternoon. Oh, I'm going to. It's going to be a good one. So we will get announcements out during the week when we get this all back together, but I have no way to stream the movie from back there and have the sound come out of either one of these speakers at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, thanks. And to everybody this morning who's scrambling. You know, I've been in the symposium for a few years. What do we say? 3 anxieties every Sunday. Will the speaker show? Will the AV work? And will people come? You know, and after all these years, somehow they put it together. So thank you for that effort. I get the great pleasure of introducing our speaker. And I want to first start, George, with what you told us how to introduce you. George and his wife, Marie, have been at Oakmont 23 years. He's been involved in a wide range of activities and has spoken at the symposium before. I'm sorry, George, that's a C paper, and I know you're an A player, so we're not doing that. How many people have seen George before? Been in any of his classes, have been at Grandparents Club, genealogy, futures, what am I forgetting? You're not going to tell me.
Computer.
We are so honored to be able to bring George back. George is also our past president of the Sunday Symposium, which we appreciate very much. Marie works with us over in the booth here. And, you know, one of the things that, if you have grandkids, when they do anything at Grandparents Club, that's him. That's Marie. So, George, without me yakking too much more, I want to really give a big warm welcome to George. And George, we're going to do the question and answer. Probably you're going to have to say the question, and we'll screen it up if you need it. George will repeat the question, and there's cards in the back if you want to write something down, a question you have right now, and we'll come collect them for you.
Okay. So today we're going to take a kind of deep dive into a historic element of America. We're going to look a little bit at the private life of Thomas Jefferson, one of our more famous early Americans. We're going to look at the impact of the institution of slavery, which was embedded in America at that time. And we're going to look at a specific person, an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, and the decisions she had to make within the context of the life she lived. And I will start with a little picture of Thomas Jefferson here. This was painted in Paris, which is where Jefferson and Hemings began their relationship. He was 45, she was 15. Okay, if you picked it up when you came in, you picked up a copy of the Jefferson Wales Hemings family tree. Okay, and when you look at that, the key person actually is John Wales. See him in the middle up there. John Wales was a self-made man here in America. He immigrated in, demonstrated his competence by working with some of the major planters, and eventually ended up making a lot of money, having a lot of property, and having a lot of slaves. And his occupation was he was a slaver. He was a slave trader. When the ship came in filled with slaves and would dock, he would show up at the dock and say, okay, I'll take them and sell them. He would even take orders. You could go to him and say, look, I'd like 2 adult women and 2 adult men, and boy, he'd order them for you and deliver them. Well, John Wales, as he made his way from the lower part of the economic spectrum to the top, married Martha Epps. And Epps was one of the first families of Virginia. Okay, so he made out pretty well with that marriage. We'll talk about the Epps family a little bit later. And they had a daughter, Martha. Unfortunately, Martha Epps did not survive her child. We'll talk a little later about the problem of childbirth, women who die in childbirth. But Martha Wales marries Thomas Jefferson. And she has 5 pregnancies. 2 children die in infancy. One, Lucy, we'll talk about later, dies fairly young. But then the other 2, Martha and Mary, grew to adulthood and married well. Uh, so John Wales, after his wife died, married twice again, buried two more wives on childbirth. And in 1761, when the third wife died, he said, to heck with this. And he took Elizabeth Hemings, who was one of his enslaved women, as his concubine. And they had 6 children. And the youngest was Sally. Okay, so you can sort of see he dies in 1773. She's born in 1773. And later in life, Thomas Jefferson takes Sally Hemings as his concubine. She has 7 pregnancies. 3 of the children die in infancy. The other 4 we'll talk about a little bit as we go through today. Okay, now what's interesting to the genealogist is it should be obvious. Martha Wales, Jefferson's wife, and Sally Hemings, his concubine, were half-sisters. They shared the same father. Okay, we all understand that. What's even more interesting to me is a very rare thing. Martha Jefferson and Mary, and Beverly Hemings and his siblings, were 3/4 siblings of each other. 3/4. They shared 3 grandparents. It was only the maternal grandmother that was different. Real rarity. Okay, Jeff, you put the lights down now. So in 1873, an editor in a little local county newspaper in Ohio decided he was going to publish some histories of some of the older people in the county. And having been an abolitionist, he kind of focused on people who had been enslaved before the war. And this is from the memoirs of Madison Hemings. After Mr. Jefferson went to France, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine. And when he was called back home, she was enchantée by him. That means pregnant. He desired to bring my mother back to Virginia. To induce her to do so, he made a solemn pledge that her children would be freed at the age of 21 years. In consequence, she returned with him to Virginia, and soon after their arrival gave birth to a child. It lived but a short time. She gave birth to 4 others, and Jefferson was the father of them all. Their names were Beverly, Harriet, Madison, myself, and Esmond. We all became free agreeably to the treaty entered into by our parents before we were born. Well, why didn't this sort of settle the issue, right? I mean, here it is. This is what we'll talk about today. But for 150 years after this, there has still been debate about, was Jefferson the father of Sally Hemings' children? Why? Well, 2 reasons. One of them was, at the time this was published, there had already been 2 biographies of Jefferson published that were what I would call the authorized biographies. And both of them had depended on what they were told by Martha Jefferson, his oldest daughter, and by her son, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, okay, who both said, oh, Sally's kids were all fathered by one of the Carr brothers. There were 2 brothers who lived in farms nearby who were cousins of Jefferson. So that started the word that, well, of course, Jefferson wasn't the father. And then after that, historians will generally look at this and say, oh, well, this is just an ex-slave. Why would you believe anything an ex-slave would say? And then they would go through a whole discussion of why ex-slaves would in fact not say things that were true, including that maybe his mother had lied to him. Okay? So it continued this way up until actually about 1974, when a biography was written by Fawn Brodie, one of the most fascinating pieces of work, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History. And what she did was she looked at the psychology of Jefferson. And one component was looking at the Sally Hemings story. And she said, sure looks to me like it's true. But her biography was not treated very well by the industry because she was more of a psychoanalyst reviewer than a biographer. So who would count what she said? Then in 1998, a woman named Annette Gordon Reed wrote a piece, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, in which she decimated what all the other historians had done and said, and basically said, you know, they refused to actually look at the facts. If they looked at the facts, they would say, gee, this is probably correct. The next year, a DNA test was done that said that Esther Hemings' male descendants were male descendants of the Jeffersons. Oops. Let's take a second with the institution of slavery. When you think about biography, you have to go back and understand historical context. You can't take 2025 standards and paste them back into 1785. If you were enslaved, your life, your expectations were all structured by your condition. And it's important to recognize that slavery was not just an economic institution. It was part of the way that the Southern plantation owners lived. They had many enslaved peoples available to make their lives comfortable. And the fact of the matter was, regardless of the socioeconomic status of the master, how kind he was, you were property. You could be sold or gifted at will, separated from your family at any time. And you were particularly subject to that in paying off debts. I'm not going to spend more time on this, but after the Atlantic slave trade ended per the Constitution in 1808, what happened was over time, the Virginia and North Carolina became the source of slaves that were then bought and used in the South, Deep South. In the 1860 census, there were roughly 4 million slaves. 1 million of them had been born in Virginia or North Carolina and were living in the Deep South, meaning they had been sold. Let's take a second with Jefferson. You can see all the great positions he held. There are two things he wrote that I'd like to just take a second with. In 1774, he wrote a pamphlet, and the pamphlet basically laid forth the issues that became the core of the Declaration of Independence. The pamphlet was widely reproduced and distributed throughout the colonies, which is one of the reasons why this person, who was not necessarily widely expected to be a major factor in the convention, was. And then I enjoyed the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Up until the war, the Revolutionary War, if you were a resident of Virginia, male resident, you had to pay a tithe tax. Every year you paid a head tax, so much per person, okay? And that was used to support the Church of England, okay? Keep all those parishes healthy. And so the whole point about the Statute of Religious Freedom was to say, nope, the government's not going to support a church. That's not part of what we're going to be. And for those etymologists in the group, I was told that the longest word in the English language was anti-disestablishmentarianism. Okay? Well, that's what this is. If you were for getting rid of this rule, you were a disestablishmentarianist. But of course, if you wanted to keep the rule, you were an anti-disestablishmentarianist. So Jefferson marries, whoops, this thing has gotten out of control here. Jefferson marries Martha Wales. She had been married before, but her husband had died. And she brings to Monticello her personal lady's maid. What was typical of the large plantation owners was each child, when they reached about the age of 2, was assigned a personal lady's maid or manservant who would be at their beck and call, theoretically, for the rest of their lives. So she bought Betty Brown. Betty Brown was one of Elizabeth Hemings. Remember Elizabeth now, John Will's other partner, one of her children. And this was the first Monticello. Sure, all of you remember this well. When Martha died, it is said that she lay on her deathbed and held Jefferson's hand and had him promise that he would not marry again because she would not have her daughters raised by a stepmother. And Jefferson gave her the solemn promise, no, he would not marry again. So Sally Hemings, along with her mother and the rest of the kids, at that time there would actually, Elizabeth Hemings had 4 kids before she had her period of 6 children with John Wales. They would have come to Monticello. At best, they would have lived in something like this. This is a slave cabin. It's about 10 by 10 and typically would house a family. Sally, when she reached the age of 6, was assigned to marry Jefferson. That was Jefferson's younger daughter by Martha. And she was assigned to marry as her maidservant. What did a lady's maid do? Well, in the morning, she would get breakfast for her mistress. Then she would help her mistress get dressed. That would mean worrying about clothing, jewelry, hair, help, brush her hair, whatever needed. Then she would do the clothing. She would repair clothing. Maybe it needed to be made larger. She would make it larger. She would worry about stains. If she wanted to take a bath, if the mistress wanted to take a bath, it would be the lady's maid who would prepare this. And this would be typical for a 6, 7-year-old who was, by the way, honored by being a lady's maid. You were treated very well. And then as the evening went on, eventually your mistress would dismiss you and you could go home and sleep for the night. So in 1784, Jefferson accepted the assignment as the ambassador of the United States to France. He headed off for France with his older daughter, Martha, and James Hemings, who was one of Sally's brothers. And he was going to have James trained as a French chef. After all, if you wanted to be a good Southern host at Monticello, what more could you ask for than a good French chef? Okay? The younger daughter, Mary, and her sister, Lucy, who was then 2, went to Eppington to be with her aunt, who then was the mistress of the Epps plantation. And of course, they would have brought Sally Hemings with them. Unfortunately, Lucy died of whooping cough. As soon as Jefferson learned that, he immediately wrote and said, you must send Mary to Paris. And so they made arrangements for Mary to go to Paris with an older enslaved woman. Unfortunately, as they were getting near the date to leave, the older enslaved woman was discovered to be pregnant. So they decided that she would not go, and instead they would send what was then the 14-year-old Sally Hemings instead. And to England. It's hard for me to see. So they landed in London. And at that time, they were met by John and Abigail Adams. John was the ambassador to England. Abigail was the hostess. She immediately wrote Jefferson and said, the girl who is accompanying Mary is completely inappropriate. She can't really be counted to care for herself. You should just send her back with the captain of the ship. However, Jefferson decided to have the Sally Hemings stay. We talk about people like John and Abigail and say, they were abolitionists. They really were against slavery. What we don't know is they were racist, and badly so. There's a famous letter from Abigail after she saw the play Othello, where she talks about how disgusted she was to see the Black Moor lay his hand on the delicate white Desdemona. So the girls go off and they go to Paris. 700,000 people, palaces, parks, museums. The largest town they might have ever been in was Williamsburg, Virginia. Probably had under 2,000 people there. So their idea, talk about blowing your mind, right? And this is where Jefferson had his residence. 24 rooms, a building built for a royal mistress. And he hosted many people from the U.S. there. Sally would have arrived in a homespun dress, probably. This was the common dress at that time recommended because it was made from American cloth, and that meant you reduced the imports you had to bring in. But Jefferson felt that his daughters would be somehow invited to events that they would need to go to, and they would need to be accompanied by their servant. So he had everybody outfitted in French fashions. That meant he spent about $1,000 in today's dollars on outfitting Sally Hemings to look like a French fashionista. John Trumbull painted this painting of the sign of the Declaration of Independence there. He also painted the piece we started off with. By the way, if you saw the recent inauguration of our current president, it was in the rotunda of the Capitol building, and this was the backdrop. He stood in front of this painting. We do not actually have a picture of Sally. She was mighty near white, very handsome, long, straight hair down her back, light colored and decidedly good looking. And there are also references to Elizabeth Hemings, her mother, where decidedly good looking is also the terminology used. So I want to look back at where we were then. The median age was 16. Women could legally marry at 15, and more interestingly, could give consent at age 10. Women would typically have 7 to 12 children, and about 50% of all women died around childbirth. And half of all children died before the age of 2. Now let's talk about the rights of an enslaved woman. You know, this was a period when the rights of all women were severely restricted. Women lived under the legal concept of coverture, which meant that a married woman had no legal rights separate from her husband. But an enslaved woman was much more limited. All children of an enslaved woman would be slaves. In other words, by definition, that's how slavery got passed from generation to generation. She could not legally deny her master if he wanted sex. She could not marry. It's a side point. I don't see the side. There we go. In addition, there was a peculiarity with the Jefferson relationship because at that time, marrying your dead wife's sister was considered to be incest. So that was not allowed. Now, what was peculiar about Hemings and Jefferson? Her mother and grandmother both had had relationships with white men. And she had never known a father. Undoubtedly, or probably, Jefferson was the closest thing to a father figure she had. And he was able to influence people with his words. I'm being disciplined here. John Meacham, who has a recent biography of Jefferson, says that Jefferson had a way with words where he could influence people even when he wasn't trying, particularly women. And Jefferson had always treated the Hemings family with great respect. Now, there's a term of art here called an octoroon. So as you make your way down the pile here, you've got Elizabeth Hemings, who is half white. We have, her father was a Captain Hemings. Her mother was an African slave. We have Sally Hemings, who was 3/4 white. Father was John Wales. and a half-white mother. So when you get to any children she had with Jefferson, they would be 7/8 white. That's called an octoroon. And at that time, now we're talking 1785, at that time, octoroons were technically white. If you were a free person of mixed race in Virginia, and you were only 1/8 black, you were a white person. Boy, did that change as you got closer to the Civil War. But there was this peculiar thing. She could be free if she wished in France. It turned out that France did not allow for slavery at that time. And if you were a slave, you could walk down to the nearest, with a lawyer, you could walk down to the nearest judge and get your slavery taken away. There were some workarounds. You think about it, there were plantation owners from the Caribbean who were big slaveholders. They would come home to Paris, and of course they could bring a slave with them. There was a workaround for people, but it would have been possible. But instead, we came to the agreement that all children born to Jefferson and Sally Hemings would be free. The only way we know for sure of that agreement is, of course, Madison Hemings' memoirs. Although, as you'll see, we also know it because that's what happened. They were going to leave in August of 1789, and in July of 1789, they saw tens of thousands of people with scythes and pitchforks running down the road in front of their house on their way to storm the Bastille. After the storming of the Bastille, they were still there a few more weeks, and Lafayette came with some of his compatriots to the embassy with Jefferson to discuss how to have a democracy in France. So they returned, and that's when Jefferson tore down that old building and decided to build what we now know as Monticello. A room was set aside for Sally. It's in the south wing of the building. I can explain later why, if you visited Monticello anytime more than 10 years ago, you wouldn't have heard of this. So now we're back to the family. Sally had the three boys and one girl who lived to adulthood. Let's take a tiny diversion. This is a famous piece from Monticello's woodworking shop. The man who ran the shop was John Hemings, who was another one of Sally's brothers. And he would make things, this was an outstanding wood shop. This is a traveling desk Jefferson had made. All three of Sally's children, but male children, were trained as woodworkers, which is how they made their money after they grew up. Oops, 1802. If you know your Jefferson history, you probably may remember this. James Callender, who was in fact a muckraking journalist, published this piece that basically said, it is well known that this man has kept as his concubine one of his slaves. Her name is Sally. He had a lot of it right, he had a lot of it wrong too. But Jefferson ignored this, and it had no trouble getting reelected president in 1804. So let's talk about the children. William Beverly Hemings is the oldest. He was born in 1798. He was named for William Beverly. William Beverly was a wealthy landowner in Virginia who had commissioned Jefferson's father to draw this early map of Virginia focused on the western parts of the state. And of course, Jefferson, as we know, had a go west mentality to him. So a copy of this map would have been in Monticello, and William Beverly, who went by Beverly, would have seen it when he went through the palace. William Beverly left in 1822 when he was 23 and moved to Washington, D.C., where he became a white, married, had a family. And we know that much from Madison Hemings' memoirs, but Hemings would not tell more about where he was and what happened. His sister Harriet was born in 1801. And when Harriet was growing up, she had been trained in various forms of sewing and needlework. Um, and she followed shortly after Beverly left, took a stagecoach to Philadelphia. The stagecoach was paid for by Jefferson's overseer, who gave her $50 in cash to take with her. That's about $1,000 in today's money. She also married as a wife, had a family, and again, Madison would not tell us more about what happened to her, and there's been no record down the genealogical tract. 1826, Jefferson dies. Most of us remember that it was July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Jefferson and John Adams died the same day. It is said that as he was lying on his last few weeks of life, he would have two of his slaves show up and sleep with him at night. And they were likely Burwell Colbert, who was his personal valet, and Sally. So this is his will. This is probably the most fascinating document, if you insist upon a document proving what you think is true. Okay, he freed 3 slaves, Burwell Colbert, who was his personal valet, John Hemings, who ran the wood shop, okay, and Joseph Fawcett, who was his blacksmith. In addition, I give also to John Hemings the service of his 2 apprentices, Madison and Eston, until their respective ages of 21, at which period I give them their freedom. Does this seem like a sort of a weird combination? It's his way of hiding what he knew he had to do. And I humbly and earnestly request of the legislature of Virginia confirmation of this bequest of freedom with permission to remain in the state. As a slave owner, he could free all of the slaves, but unless the legislature agreed, they had to leave the state. So he has died. The 2 boys rent a house in Charlottesville, and Sally goes and lives with them. She is never freed, but she has done what's called given her time, which means that Martha Jefferson essentially says, I don't need any more from you. Go and be what you will be. And she died in 1835. So let's look at Madison. I'm a genealogy junkie, and this is fascinating to me. This is the 1870 census, okay? And today, any of you can sign on to the line. If you know where to look, you can go get a copy of it. I just copied this out of the online. But in 1870, of course, it would only have gone to a small number of places to be kept and counted. Here's Madison Hemings. He's 65. He's a farmer. $1,500 in real estate, $300 personal estate. This man is the son of Thomas Jefferson. Okay? So he was obviously generally recognized as at least saying he was the son of Jefferson. His most famous descendant is Frederick Madison Robert. He was a businessman in Los Angeles and the first African-American elected to the California legislature. He served 8 terms and is credited with being the man who introduced the legislation to form UCLA. So let's go to Eston. Eston was named after Thomas Eston Randolph, who was a close personal friend of Jefferson's. The boys moved to Ohio with their families after Sally died in 1835. Madison stayed there. But in 1852, there was the Dred Scott decision. If you remember, that's the one that said that slaves were property, and if a slave had escaped to the North, the Northerners had to help recoup that property for the Southerner who owned them, which meant the slave traders would make the slavers would make their way up north and arrest people, take them south and sell them, whether they were free or not. So Eston said, to heck with this, picked up his family, moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where he arrived as E.H. Jefferson, a white. And his most famous descendant was his son, John Wales Jefferson, born in 1835. You'll note the name Wales up there. He was a colonel in the 8th Wisconsin Infantry, fought and was wounded at Vicksburg, and became a wealthy broker after the war. And just to give due where it's due, the youngest son of Martha, Jefferson Randolph, was the Secretary of War in Jefferson Davis's cabinet. I'd love to go through this, don't have time, but these are all of Betty Hemings' children. And if you glance up and down the list, you will see they all made out very well in the context of being slaves. So how do we know that Jefferson was the father? Well, we have Calendar's article. He was a good researcher. We have Madison Hemings' article. We know the Hemings were treated specially, and that Sally had her own room. We know that she was not given to Mary when Mary died. Mary married. If you think about what we've talked about, that would have been normal for a household like the Jeffersons. The children were all named the people important to Jefferson. The boys were trained in woodworking. 3 played the violin. We've talked about who was freed. In 1968, a researcher went through an elaborate process of looking at all of the records on the letters, the farm books Jefferson kept religiously, and showed that Sally Hemings had only become pregnant when Jefferson was at Monticello. And this was kind of important because during this period, he had been Secretary of State, Vice President, and then President. And so he was not in Monticello 75% of the time. And of course, the DNA test. And that's a clincher. So Jefferson dies. He is deeply in debt, the equivalent of about $4 billion today. He liked living very well. He liked good wines. He liked good books. He liked to entertain. He liked having a lot of enslaved people who would care for him. And nobody wanted to buy Monticello. So it was abandoned. And they finally reached the conclusion that the only way they could try to pay off the debts was, in fact, to sell the negroes. So this is Jefferson and slavery. Just take a minute, run your eyes down that list. He was the 2nd largest slaveholder in the county of Albemarle, Virginia. He had grown up in a slave-owned home. His world was built around enslaved people working for him. At the time the 1790 census was done, 38% of the people in Virginia were slaves. Now let's talk a moment about Mary Hemings. Mary was the oldest child of Elizabeth Hemings. And when Jefferson was in Paris, she was hired out to a local merchant, Thomas Bell. Hiring out was a way that if you had extra slaves, you could make some money by basically having somebody take them who was willing to pay for them. So, well, Thomas Bell fell for Mary, and they became a couple, and they became an acknowledged couple in the community of Charlottesville. Okay, she had 3 children who had been born before she went down to be with Bell, and she wanted him to buy them. He bought her, but he said no. Then they had 2 children, and Bell died in 1800, and Mary and her children inherited the business. And by the way, we're all freed. One of the children she left behind was Joseph Fawcett, who became a blacksmith. He was freed in Jefferson's will. Good news, right? His wife and 8 children were not free, and they were put up at the auction. He had some ability to save some money because when he worked as a blacksmith, he had some work he could do on his own, and Jefferson let him keep some money. Mary had some money, And between the two of them, they were able to buy his wife and his 2-year-old and his 8-year-old. But his 3 adult daughters were sold south. So this was the life you lived if you were an enslaved person. You were a person who basically was property that could be sold, and regardless of how nice Jefferson had been to the Hemings family, no matter how well they were treated, when the time came, some of them had to be sold. And that's why Sally made out well, because her family were all freed. Real quickly, we talked about the books here. Annette Gordon Reed is a fascinating person. She holds a dual appointment in the history and law schools at Harvard. She has won the National Book Award, MacArthur Prize. She is an exceptional researcher. So with all that in mind, I want to do a brief call out to Ann Neal. Ann, are you here someplace? Anyway, Ann, I saw her earlier. Ann was kind enough to look over some of these slides earlier and yell at me when I was doing something dumb. So as we leave, how did the institution of slavery impact behavior in this period of American history? And how did it impact Sally and her relationship to Jefferson? Some things to think about. And now I will take questions. And what we're going to have to do is Virginia and Jane will come around and gather the question and convey it to me. I'll repeat it, and then I'll answer it.
Questions from the floor, too.
We have one coming in. One of Jefferson's biographies stated that in his early days, he stated America should end slavery, but with political ambitions, he realized this was not well received, so he dropped the idea. Jefferson had sort of a schizophrenic view of slavery. He knew it was wrong. He would write about it as wrong. It was the wolf by the tail problem. You know, we've got the wolf by the tail. Now what do we do? The problem was 38% of the human beings in Virginia were slaves. What do? There was a terror that if they were freed, they would turn on the white population. Okay. So Jefferson eventually backed away, including the fact that in the original write-up he did for the Declaration, he had put a clause in about how the King of England had forced them to have slavery, and he took that out. What happened to the records with his children? I'm not sure I understand the question. Yeah, the two who left earlier, okay, deliberately changed their person to become a white person with no background that would imply they had any African-American blood. Okay, so think about it. You're Harriet. You arrive up in Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia. You know, you're a nice-looking white gal, age 20 years old. You know, hey, that's pretty good. You're going to be looking for a husband. You get a nice husband. Are you going to tell him that you're mixed plate? I suspect not. You can repeat it if you. What is the legacy of slavery today? Well, that's beyond me. If I could, I'd call Ann up to answer that question. The thing to remember about slavery is it was something that was built into the way in which people lived then. And whether you liked it or not, it was far beyond economic. We often think of it as being you had to have the slaves to pick the cotton. Go look at how many slaves were in Charleston, South Carolina, going into the war. They weren't picking cotton. They were driving carriages. They were making dinners. They were serving them. Okay? It was built into the life of those people. And over the years, there has been a real problem in trying to make up for that. That's about all I can say. Are there any other founding fathers who are fathers of enslaved people? Not that is known. There have been comments that Madison may have been, and comments that who quite knows what Jackson did in his life. But no, as far as known, Jefferson's the only one that's known.
That Jefferson had a brother, which you didn't mention, and that Hemings could have come from the brother, not from Jefferson.
Yeah, there were 8 people who were. Oh, okay. The question was, were there not other Jefferson descendants whose DNA could have matched with Jefferson's, and therefore could have been the father or ancestor for Eston's children? And the answer is, in a super technicality, yes. Okay, but that's where the work that was done that proved that the only time that Sally Hemings got pregnant was when Jefferson was in Monticello. So you had to sort of go through the process of saying that one of these other people had to regularly be in Monticello and choose to be around those times. Okay, and there's no evidence of any of that.
You make a comment that the 2 presidents that died on the same day were actually picked.
This was the comment which we all know that Jefferson and Adams had a falling out for years early on because of their political opposition. But they came back together toward the end of their lives, corresponded, and of course died the same day, which is a fascinating piece of history. The question was, when did the one drop of black blood turn you into a mulatto? Should be the term of art for a person of mixed blood. And the answer was toward the Civil War. As you got closer and closer to the Civil War, there was no tolerance for people of mixed blood. As a matter of fact, in a complete diversion, if you look at the censuses between 1880 and 1920, one of the things they were careful about was trying to determine if you were a mixed blood, what percentage you were, because it was factually known that if you were not of a pure blood, but a mixed blood, you would be less healthy. And they wanted to estimate what the cost of it. Yeah.
I don't know how accurate, from the reading I've done, I mean, they certainly still there, but it's a great thing to watch. Yes. Then I have a question, and it's about, know that Jefferson was a brilliant inventor on top of all these other things, but results from the things I've read, he may not have been the architect of the new Monticello, but one of his sons might have been that, as well as some of those inventions. You show that there were 3 sons that were brilliant woodworkers. So do you know about this?
I think it's safe to say this is a question about whether or not Jefferson actually did design Monticello, even though he was a great inventor. But there are other people who might have helped, including some of the sons. I don't think there's any evidence at all. There's lots and lots of documentary evidence in his hand, where he's made the drawings for what Monticello is, and he writes about the concept of Monticello. I think it's fairly clear it was his. Others?
Wondering how they were able to do DNA tests, for, people 100 years ago or so.
Okay. This is my wheelhouse. I know this one really well. When you have DNA, the specific thing that is associated with a man is that in addition to the X chromosome, he has a Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome is specific to having gotten it from his father. Okay? Everybody with me so far? Okay. Well, if I got my Y chromosome from my father, where did he get his Y chromosome from? His father. You can go back 1,000 years. You can go back 5,000 years. Okay. There's a different thing for women, which is called mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA. We'll pass on that. But Y DNA is how they did it. And it was one of the first tests that really was done that way. But I guarantee you, it's 100%er. Which other founding fathers were slave owners? And specifically George Washington. Essentially all the Southern presidents were slave owners. If you were well enough off, you would have been a slave owner. And by the way, a lot of people who lived in the South were slave owners who had one slave. Okay, I mean, I'm talking about a farm family might have one slave. George Washington was a peculiar case. He had a few more. Jefferson had the most slaves that he owned. Washington had more slaves, but 2/3 of them were owned on behalf of the Custis children. You'll remember that his wife, Martha, had been previously married, had 2 children by that husband, and he had been the source of those slaves which Washington held as a fiduciary for his children, so that when they reached age, they would have this wealth, because so he couldn't do it, but he freed his own slaves. And I've never quite understood the details of it, but there was a complex story about he freed most of the slaves, and some of them he only freed after Martha died, because he wanted to be sure that some of them cared for Martha. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, I think I understand that. The question was, why did Jefferson select a black man for the Lewis and Clark expedition? And the answer was he didn't. The black man was the personal servant of Lewis or Clark, you might remember one of them, is his personal servant, and he chose to take it. But Jefferson had nothing to do with it. Jefferson only picked Lewis, who in turn picked Clark. What was the first name? Anita. I'm not aware of Anita Hemings. So the story that's being passed on is Anita Hemings, who was a descendant of Sally's, was apparently went as white and was at some point outed by some people who wanted to out her. Roommate, Pastor. Yes. They did get, where did they get Jefferson's DNA? They did. They got it from, remember the discussion earlier that there were 8 other, okay, from one of the other descendants of Peter Jefferson, who was Jefferson's father. Okay, but you're right. The only way you know who Jefferson's male descendants are is they were all Sally's kids.
definitive, book about that, about the Hemings family, all the connections, the dress code. Why, would it be that it's so hard to believe what she was talking about? You mentioned that also. Could you say more about that?
It's kind of hard to put yourself in the head. Oh, okay, question. Ann was asking, given that Annette Gordon Reed did this absolutely superb job of research, tying everything together in a 2008 book titled The Hemingses, Hemings at Monticello, An American Family, how come people still don't believe that? And the answer has to do with not wanting to believe it. The people who fight it, continue to fight it even today, are typically descendants of the Martha Jefferson, Mary Jefferson lines, okay, who want to defend the idea that somehow the idea that their ancestor had a concubine was unacceptable. And it was just the way things were. It was not that rare. Okay, I mean, that's all I can say.
I also missed that the net was made in an African American scholar.
Yeah.
And so, same thing, who would believe?
Yeah, well, we'll pass on the DEI elements of that discussion. Ann was saying that it had to do in part with the fact that Gordon Reed is African American, and therefore who would want to believe an African American professor at Harvard who has won the MacArthur Prize, and if you want to really dig into how research is done, read her book. Her book is unbelievably accurate, no fiction. I have one more question over here. Last question.
Several years ago, looking for photo albums of cousins, and we found a black woman in there. She is a relative, and nobody talked about it.
I don't know if you heard that or not, but it was a comment about how they found a photo album that had a bunch of family members. One of them turned out to be black. And I will say that in my own family, there are several examples, because we are Southern, where I can point to blacks who are, let us say, in the wind. Is that a question?
That Sally here with
No. Question was, did Sally appear in social settings with Jefferson? And the answer is no, none at all. Chillicothe? If you know where Chillicothe is, okay, I don't, but that's where they went. Pike County, and then there's a county right next to Pike. There are two right there.
Something here, George?
In the sixties, I lived in Virginia, and at that time, the white descendants of Jefferson got together once a year for a reunion. I don't know the state, and the black descendants got together separately, and the two sides couldn't agree to get together. Do you know, do the descendants of Jefferson and Sally still get together once a year?
So the question of the statement, let's say, was that over time, the descendants of the Martha Wales Jefferson line and the descendants of the Sally Hemings line would have separate, but would get together regularly in an annual kind of get together. And over time, gradually, it has become accepted that Sally's children were Jefferson's children, with the exception of some people who will probably always not want to believe it. But the answer to the specific question is, they now meet together. But there's a little oddity here. Jefferson is buried in the Jefferson plot which happens to be on the property of Monticello, but is not part of Monticello. And as such, if you are a descendant of Martha Wales Jefferson, you can be buried there, but not if you're a descendant of Sally. Okay. How far back in our history can DNA test determine your lineage? The answer is that the Y-DNA can detect male lineage essentially back 1,000 years plus, and mitochondrial DNA can detect female lineage. That means mother's 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 mother. Okay, again about 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, there are Jewish descendants who are allowed to be counted as Jewish in Israel if they can prove that their maternal DNA matches one of 5 women who were born around 1500. But for regular DNA, which means what you and I all carry and who is your great-grandfather's wife, okay, probably about 5 generations is accurate, maybe in some cases 7. Not sure. This was the last question on DNA. If you're not tracking your paternal line or your maternal line, what do you use? There's what there is autosomal. It's called AUTOSOMAL DNA, which we all carry. We carry DNA for 23 chromosomes. It's like I forget how many millions worth of linkages there are. Well, what they've done is they've gone through and figured out the ones that really can distinguish one person from another. And by using those, they can basically say who's related to whom. Long lecture, not for today. Can you repeat that? Okay, we're back to what was the life of Sally Hemings like at Monticello? And the answer was she was a specially set aside slave who did things like she would clean Jefferson's quarters. She would obviously be available for anytime he wanted to meet with her. Okay, but she had nothing to do with the running of the house in the way that you might have imagined with a wife. Now, it was complicated. Why? Martha Jefferson married a Randolph, and that marriage was a disaster. We could get into that. That's another whole story. But as a result of that, she separated, not in a legal sense, but she separated from her husband and instead lived with Jefferson, and she and her children lived with Jefferson most of their lives. So the actual mistress of Monticello was Martha Jefferson Randolph. In fact, she was, think about it, she was, in fact, the person who was recorded as the first lady when he was president. Right? He had no wife. But no, Sally never was in a role that you would even begin to call that of a spouse. Okay. Thank you.